Distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests. I welcome you to this year's virtual edition of the presentation of the Peace Report 2021, the joint yearbook of the 4 leading German institutes for peace and conflict research. Thank you very much for your interest in today's event. As usual, we link the presentation to a current EU debate on foreign security and defense policy. This year, under the heading, Europe can do better, the EU between institutional constraints and civil and military responsibilities. It has become a good tradition to organize this event together with the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, and I want to thank Renate ten Busch and Sidonie Wetzig for the good cooperation, and Sidonie especially for the moderation. Now I would like to welcome our panelists and speakers. First, Professor Ursula Schröder as the editor-in-chief of this year's report, and the newly installed Protestant Bishop for the Bundeswehr, Dr. Bernhard Fellenberg. Great to have you with us. Moreover, I'm very happy that we managed to have competent voices from the European Parliament and from the European External Action Service. A warm welcome to MEP Hanna Neumann and Sonja Momberg from the EEAS. Last but not least, I'm glad to welcome peace researcher Matthias Dembinski among us, one of the authors of the Peace Report from the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. According to the Global Peace Index, the state of peace in the world deteriorated further in 2020, not least due to the coronavirus pandemic, showing global dependencies and institutional weaknesses in crisis resilience. In addition, multilateralism, a core element in the EU's foreign policy and identity, and an essential element of its approach to peace and security, is under increasing pressure from competing value systems and ideologies. Working on a new relationship with the UK, getting back on track with the US, finding a balanced approach to Russia, and dealing with China's global ambitions, as well as migration, disruptive technologies, and climate change, are just some challenges highlighting the pressure on the EU to provide for a concrete and targeted EU external action. The statement in the EU Global Strategy of 2016 is therefore still very much up to date. I quote, "We live in a world of predictable unpredictability." It remains also a valid statement that we live in a more connected, a more contested, and a more complex world, and that the EU has to find a common approach to deal with it. The strategic compass is supposed to outline the way forward, making the EU's ambition in the field of security and defense policy more concrete. In many aspects, the compass can build on existing elements like the EU's peace and security toolbox, strong partnerships, and the EU's strengths as a widely recognized conflict mediator. Already existing initiatives in the area of security and defense policy, like PESCO, etc., need a fine-tuning though. The EU crisis resilience needs to be enhanced, and a common security and defense culture based on shared values and objectives is still something to work towards too. Obviously, Europe can do better to become weltpolitikfähig, and we want to discuss what kind of a security and defense actor the EU wants to become. I'm very much looking forward to hearing possible answers today, which is an interesting exchange, and now hand over to my colleague Renate ten Busch.
Thank you very much, Katrin. Thank you for your warm words, and also for the good cooperation that we had so many years now. And a warm welcome also from my side on behalf of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung to the audience and our distinguished panelists. Yeah, as you mentioned, Katrin, the cooperation between Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, EKD, and the editors of the Peace Report is a good tradition that we have since 2016. And due to the pandemic, we unfortunately had to skip it last year, the discussion for the Peace Report in Brussels. So the launch of the Peace Report to a Brussels-based audience is, as you mentioned, also always a good opportunity to reflect challenges of EU foreign and security policy against the background of the recommendations of the report. And if you look for a central theme of all the discussions, we can see that the challenges of the EU is facing in the field of foreign and security and defense policy have definitely not diminished. On the contrary, the political dynamics are high and new challenges are constantly coming up. And you mentioned several of them already, Katrin, in your speech. And in the past 5 years, we have seen steps towards deeper integration in the field of defense on the EU level. PESCO, European Defence Fund, even the setup of a Directorate General for Defence and Industry and Space. And what is now expected is that the EU and the member states agree on a strategic compass that defines common objectives and ambitions for its security and defense policy. You spoke about it. So we hope to provide with this event a contribution to the debate on the strategic objectives and ambitions of the EU as a peace-oriented foreign and security actor. What does it take for the EU to become a stronger and more sovereign actor in foreign policy and to do better as the peace report promises? And for the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, this event is also part of a greater project on sovereign Europe. And in this project, which is running for more than a year, or will run for more than a year, we are discussing the issues of sovereign Europe under different aspects like peace and security, but also democracy and values, socio-ecological transformation, multilateralism and geopolitics, social and just economy, and socio-economic transformation. If you are interested in more of that, please contact us. Yeah, and having said this, I'm finished already. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. And now I'm very much looking forward to an interesting debate. And thanks a lot to our partners, to you, Katrin, and your team, and also to my team for organizing this event here today, and obviously for the authors of the report for compiling such a very interesting and fascinating piece. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And with these words, we enter into medias res and are now very interested to hear from Professor Ursula Schröder. She's director at the Institute for Peace and Security Policy at the University of Hamburg. And as mentioned before, editor-in-chief of the Peace Report 2021. So we are very interested in her giving us an overview on this year's publication.
Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm one of the editors of the Peace Report that we published together with the Bonn International Center for Conversion, the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, and the Institute for Development in Peace in Duisburg. And it's our yearly pleasure, unless the pandemic, inhibits that, to present this in Brussels as well. And we titled our report this year as Europe Can Do Better, and we have published, and this is a book presentation as well, a 150-page report on trends and global trends of peace and security in the world, seen from a German and European perspective. I won't go into the 150 pages here, but it's all online to download, and some of it in English, most of it in German. And the core question I've been asked to focus on here today is how to move towards a sovereign Europe and how to calibrate civil and military responsibilities in this context. And this is also what we focused on in one of our chapters. And in principle, I will go into 3 recommendations that we have and into our baseline analysis of how we see trends developing worldwide. And the first one is simple. Our baseline assessment is that it's not been a great year for peace and security worldwide. We know that the pandemic has wreaked havoc around the world with negative consequences, in particular for human security. And in particular this year, Europe and the European Union in particular is confronted with very uncomfortable challenges for peace and security, the global pandemic being only one of them. Climate crisis and also violent conflicts in the neighborhood and the erosion of democratic procedures, both within Europe and abroad, are the core driving factors that we see as harming international peace and security. If you like, it's a perfect storm. And we argue in the report that Europe needs to do more to get us out of this storm. And we argue that global crises of the scope that we are seeing today can only be overcome by cooperation, and that the EU needs to become a more effective actor in global politics. And for us, this means that the EU can not only do more, it also needs to do more, as we observe that the EU has behaved too hesitantly in some of the complex crisis constellations in its neighborhood, but also globally, and it needs to sharpen its profile. And we make 3 points. The first of it is that Europe needs to think and act globally. While we acknowledge that Europe is neither the largest nor the most influential player on the world stage at the moment, we show that the EU must for once clarify its relationship with the major powers, including China. And while Sino-American relations are permeated with mistrust, we argue in the report that there is greater potential for some cooperation between the EU and China, and that Europe should make use of this to push for a greater focus on peace in the rivalry among great powers that we see emerging in a new world order, if you like. And the second thing here is that the EU, and this is a strong point for the EU, needs to shift its focus in its relationship with the global south. And the pandemic offers us an opportunity here to show greater solidarity in the global realm, and also the willingness to shape policy. As the EU has a self-interest in stopping the spread of the pandemic and the mutations that we see coming our way, we know that the COVID pandemic, it does actually not pose a threat, an immediate threat of war, but it does exacerbate existing conflict constellations. It's a bit like the climate crisis in this aspect. It is a threat multiplier for human security, and therefore it offers the chance to do something about it, because the EU has been a strong player in development policy all along, when we know the budgets that are in the system here. So Europe should move quickly to strengthen the COVAX, the COVID-19 vaccines global access initiatives for fair access to vaccines. It should move to push for significant financial transfers and debt relief for the global south. It should particularly target those most at risk at the moment, and it should expand and reform governance support, as we believe that a central component of support for countries in the global south is a support to healthcare and societal security measures at the moment. And obviously all of that costs money. So the resources for this, we argue in our report, is that we call for the construction of a COVID peace dividend. We know the post-Cold War peace dividend, and we call for something similar faced with such a large crisis that we have. So we call for a new prioritization of security policy, as Corona and COVID cannot be fought militarily. And it's undoubtedly one of the largest crises of our times. And that's why we are committed to lowering military expenditures and to intermittently, for a defined process or a defined number of years, to move back from higher military spending that we've seen also throughout the pandemic, and to move towards putting this amount of funding into a global COVID-19 recovery fund to fund post-pandemic reconstruction. And we know that violent conflict is costly. We calculate in our report how costly it is. So a double strategy of moving away from violent conflict and fostering peace, and lowering military expenditures also in the context of the NATO 2% goal, could move us towards a more equitable world in the next years. And by that we mean a moratorium on higher defense spending, which we have seen as some of the COVID assistance also benefits the military. And the second recommendation that we have is to expand and reconfigure the debate about Europe's strategic autonomy. As we see the largest global challenge as the COVID-19 pandemic, as climate change, they require non-military responses and cooperative responses. And we see in the EU debate about strategic autonomy a strong preference for focusing on defense capabilities, which in itself we concede is not wrong. We do argue that we need competences and capacities to be able to internally and externally defend also the European way of life, but we argue that the focus has been too strongly on defense, and that the European debate on European strategic autonomy should be grounded in peace policy, of course, and focus on global challenges that might be non-military in scope. And for that, we need an actor in the EU that is capable of guaranteeing its internal and external security. And therefore, we need a couple of things from this process that we haven't seen so far. And one I'm looking forward to debate more in this discussion today, and that is the definition of strategic ends, not only means. We've been talking a lot about specific military capabilities, And we've been talking much less about the for what we are building this strategic autonomy. What are the ends that we want to achieve? And we know that the EU is internally divided on foreign policy points. So the debate should move towards assessing the civil potential of the EU and to including that into this debate that we've seen. And the EU should develop a clearer strategic narrative that goes beyond what we've seen today. And we see the compass that we'll debate later as one necessary step, and we would like to see it implemented, but we're not quite sure how far this compass will actually take us. So that will be interesting. And this is also an obvious point. We seek to prioritize the implementation of civilian capabilities that we see lagging behind. We know that the civil compact of the EU has not been fully implemented, and it's been an ongoing debate that's been with us forever. And we would like to see movement for the EU so that the EU can support a UN system in crisis that is underfunded and can take up its share in civilian peace building, as we know that the lion's share of EU missions is actually civilian, and we should move to professionalize the under infrastructure for these missions. And thirdly, we should broaden our understanding of autonomy towards internal security and societal cohesion issues, as we know that many of the greatest challenges are not to the outside of our territory, but permeate the European Union and Europe. And we must understand issues of societal resilience and internal security as a field of European autonomy. As we know, in a globally interconnected world, the EU has to be autonomous in the field of cyber and economic policy in order to remain capable of acting domestically in a sovereign way. So we seek to broaden the field of debate about autonomy and seek to move it towards a peace policy-oriented area. And finally, the third point, we have looked at the expansion of European armaments cooperation and argue that European armaments cooperation has to be linked more closely to a strengthening of arms export controls. In our third chapter of the report, we show that these two policy fields are closely linked, but are in effect treated as separate. As we see with PESCO, the EDF, and other agreements, we are creating structures that are able to advance European armaments cooperation. We do argue in the report that we see this as, in principle, positive, that we can reduce the 180 or so types of large weapon systems currently in use in the EU and move it to closer to 30 over the long term, and therefore develop an ability to save funds on military procurement. But at the moment, the planned European arms cooperation within the EDA framework is putting pressure on arms export controls, and arms export controls at the EU level remain weak. And as from a German perspective, as the fourth largest arms exporter, we argue that Germany has a particular obligation to initiate and drive forward an arms control reform process at the EU level. And we recommend, of course, that member states, governments should reduce arms exports from the EU to third countries. They should apply the rules of the common position on arms exports more strictly. And we have two procedural points. That is that the role of the European Parliament in questions of arms control should be upgraded. This could be done without changes in the competences laid down by law, and could, for instance, be done by establishing a subcommittee on arms exports control within the Parliament. And we argue that risk assessment on arms exports should be Europeanized. This speaks also to the compass. What are we doing things for? With governments arriving at joint risk assessments within the framework of COARM, the Council Working Group responsible for this, and this information could then be pooled at the EEAS. And as a final argument, we see overall that the EU has struggled in many fields in its efforts to deal with the current pandemic, to deal with challenges in the neighborhood, in the Donbas region, for instance, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and it remains internally divided. And we see that as a result, the EU has ceded influence to states like Russia and Turkey, and a trend we have observed across various violent conflicts in the EU neighborhood. Think Libya, also think Syria, and we are convinced that the EU can do better here, and that a Europe, dedicated to the normative foundations of the European peace project, can combat the erosion of democracy initially within Europe, but also worldwide, and that the economic potential for Europe to play a more active role on the global political stage exists. So we are optimistic that the EU can do better, but we also urge Europe to do more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Schröder, for this very comprehensive overview, and I'm sure we will touch upon some of the recommendation you mentioned later on. Let's now move on to a Protestant perspective. The concept of just peace is at the heart of the Protestant peace ethics, and the preferential option for non-violence prevails there. As Protestant Church in Germany, we are arguing for a strong role of the EU as a soft power, but also acknowledge the manifold geopolitical and internal challenges in a world out of balance. Therefore, the debate on the future role of the EU in the area of security and defense is very topical for us. I'm now very happy that the rather newly appointed Protestant bishop at the Bundeswehr, Dr. Bernhard Fellenberg, is with us and will share some reflections in this direction with us now. Mr. Fellenberg, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Hatzinger, dear colleagues, sisters and brothers in Jesus Christ. Europe can do better. The authors of the 2021 Peace Report hold this conviction. Therefore, they recommend that the strategic autonomy of Europe should be aligned with the principles of peace policies. Global challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic or climate change call for non-military solutions. It is crucial for the strategic autonomy of Europe to emphasize the civil components of foreign and defense policies. From the perspective of my church, I can only agree with this reasoning. The Protestant Church in Germany has continuously emphasized the significance of Europe as a source of peace. Europe holds great responsibility for political strategy of prevention and de-escalation. We, as the Church, attentively observe the ongoing evolution of European foreign and security strategies and the further development of the European Union's self-understanding. The global strategy of the European Union of 2016 stresses the importance of resilience as a basic principle for European foreign and defense policies. The security of Europe is increasingly depicted as a chance. I'm convinced that ongoing efforts towards an independent defensibility do not inevitably lead to militarization. They can rather lead to inner confidence building, which enables us to perform better in many different fields of politics. From the perspective of peace ethics, the question is raised about how much room will be given to the mission of peace within the European strategy. A minimal consensus of all member states won't be enough to keep Europe as a project of peace alive. Europe needs to fund her civil instruments equally. Central points of criticism have continued to be relevant for many years now. Strategic assigning of the foreign and defense policies to a current peace political framework orientated the overall strategy of the European Union is lacking. And there is a lack of transparency and democratic legitimization of the separate processes. First, expectations of the churches. The council presidencies of Germany, Portugal, Slovenia had as a goal to bring the strategic cultures of the European member states closer together. Germany introduces a strategic compass for the joint security and defense politics. Both efforts are to be welcomed. It is crucial that the strategic compass exceeds the mere listing of instruments for the security and defense of the Union. Clarification of the goals for the culture of defense and security are also needed. The 4 dimensions of the compass can contribute to a successful clarification. The dimensions are crisis management, resilience, skills, and partnerships. Deeply linked to the process is the project of a joint analysis of threats. This project contributes to an objectification of the debate. In a time in which Europe is facing tangible threats, it becomes more challenging to broaden the view of the people of Europe so that they take a look at remote conflicts and reflect the European ability or duty to act within the remote conflicts. Therefore, it is very likely that resilience will be a more pertinent issue than conflict resolutions. Within the eastern member states of the European Union, the topic of European defense is more prevalent than the topic of crisis management in favor of third parties. It is important that the goals and means of coping with conflicts are dealt with. The compass can help in doing so. It is crucial that within the European Union, the entanglement of military measures and civil instruments of crisis management will be strengthened systematically. The member states of the European Union spend more for humanitarian aid, civil stabilization, and measures of development than the United States of America. Nevertheless, we must acknowledge that integrated approaches in which civil and military aspects come together within a broader strategy are only seldom put in use. This weakens the effectivity of our efforts on a national level as well as on multinational level such as NATO, United Nations, or European Union. I support the demand of the 2021 Peace Report to find a clear allocation of tasks with the different organizations of institutional protection of peace within the European Union. The European Union needs to strengthen and to develop her role of being a peace power internationally. At the same time, the European Union is sometimes involved in conflicts herself, as in the Ukraine. Therefore, the European Union needs strong partners such as UC and NATO. As churches, we stress the point that a policy of joint security presupposes trust. But it is also true, trust presupposes security. Both are crucial on a level of cooperation between the member states, but also at the level of engagement of individual European citizens with one another. It is of great importance to deal with the issues of cybersecurity or artificial intelligence and to improve the security of networks and systems within Europe. But it is also crucial to keep in mind that disinformation and radicalization develop according to social conditions. The central question is how we live European values. The credibility of the European Union is linked to the handling of illiberal tendencies in countries such as Hungary or Poland. The credibility, furthermore, depends on finding a good way to take into consideration that we take historic experiences serious for our contemporary thinking about and acting on principles such as freedom of speech or freedom of opinion. The idea of European lifestyle must not become a means of exclusion, as the 2021 Peace Report puts it. Resilience and cohesion emerge where different opinions have endured and common convictions are fought for. The European Union itself, it's Europe's greatest project. Europe's power to act derives in great part from the cohesion of her civil societies and functionally of her democratic institutions. The churches played a major role in reconciliation and recreating resilience after 1945. They should do so today and work for a greater understanding amongst different groups and individuals with society. That is more fruitful than mourning their increasing marginalization. Second, the first impulses. The European Union received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. Advisable. The European Union is a great peace project. In the light of changing environment of security politics, it is necessary to construct military capability cooperatively. The expenditure on defense of all European member states is with approximately 200 billion euros, the second highest in the world. The number 1.5 million soldiers is the most extensive in the world. Nevertheless, Europe become a global military power would only bring another military ally to the field. If Europe implements her full potential of security and defense skills, including military skills, and if Europe uses these skills for prevention of conflicts, as well as aversion of that which jeopardize peace, Europe would become a significant protagonist, stating that multilateralism is a successful way for the future of our world. To become such a protagonist, the European Union needs to focus on the priority of preventive strategies without neglecting compliant means of military intervention. Europe needs to expand and develop civil and military instruments for conflict management. Europe needs to cooperate with non-governmental organizations and with international security organizations, especially with the United Nations. All of this is possible within the framework of the strategic compass. It is necessary that some states proceed resolutely, even though this may become challenging for others within the European Union. It is important that these states are able to be flexible in their actions and link these actions while at the same time legitimizing the greater framework of the Union. Fantasy, a sense for European solidarity, and a sure instinct are necessary, along with transparency for all member states and open doors for those who need more time. Conclusion. Europe can do better. And at the same time, Europe remains a great vivid symbol for peaceful solution and integration of divergent interests. I see it as the great responsibility of our churches to call for an ongoing European commitment for peace. The churches need to demand a broadening of the view beyond the immediate threats and beyond the mere security of Europe herself. I'm thankful for the 2021 Peace Report, which is a stimulating and qualified input on that matter. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fellenberg. Also a very warm welcome from my side. I'm Sidonie Wetzig, and I'm Policy Officer for Foreign Security and Defense Policy at the FES office here in Brussels. I have the pleasure to moderate today's panel discussion with our distinguished guests who have already been introduced, with Hannah Neumann, Member of the European Parliament, Sonja Momberg, representative from the European External Action Service, and Matthias Dembinski from the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt. So also welcome again. In the light of the findings of the peace report, we would like to discuss the concept of strategic autonomy. Well, a concept that has been amply already discussed in several foreign policy debates, but it still leaves, I think, plenty of room for interpretation. And there's hope that the strategic compass might give some guidance of where the EU is going with its strategic autonomy. We would like to address the question on how to strike actually the balance between the institutional constraints and well, the need for civilian missions and also military operations, and especially to pursue a peace-oriented foreign and security policy. You're very welcome to join the panel discussion by indicating your comments and questions into the chat. But I first would like to start with Mr. Dembinski, who is senior researcher at the PRIF and author of one of the well, part of the peace report, especially on the chapter on what does Europe want, and looking at the strategic autonomy from a peace policy perspective. So the peace report is rather optimistic with regards to what the EU can actually do better, and that it actually should and could if the political will was there. Mr. Dembinski, with the given institutional constraints, what objectives, common objectives and ambitions do you actually see realistically to be possibly achieved and expected to follow the discussion on the strategic compass?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sidonia, and thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss this year's Peace Research Institute. Before I answer your question, let me maybe give you some background. We should always keep in mind what the European Union is and what the European Union is not. I mean, the European Union is not a unitary state. It is a compound of state. And as a compound of states, the European Union has structural limits and weaknesses, but it also has certain strengths. The European Union, for example, is very, very good at structural peace building. The European Union is a respected and trusted partner in multilateralism. And many other states prefer to work with the European Union to build a rule-based global order. On the other hand, the European Union is rather ill-suited to do robust military interventions. And the peace report recommends that the EU should focus on its strength and should not venture into the business of military interventions. Of course, there are also other reasons why the EU should be careful not to overemphasize the military instruments, and Ursula has already mentioned some of them. I might also add the recent experiences in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in Mali. This really, which really put up a warning signs before to be over enthusiastic what you can achieve with military instruments. Nevertheless, I also do see that the way how the European Union is organized and is institutionalized, especially in the field of security and defense policy, is in need of reform. This does not mean that we will transform the European Union into a more unitary actor, but it means that we have to deal with the tendency of internal blockages that we observe time and again. And if you just allow me to give you one example, one recent example, that was the recent European Council. And again, I mean, it's interesting to compare how the United States and how the European Union behaves in this field and how they react to how they organize their policies. Joe Biden, as American president, he could just decide to do what is obviously needed. That is to sit down and talk with Putin about rules of the road and about issues of common interest. Merkel and Macron tried to do the same and proposed a kind of a dual track approach of dialogue and additional restrictive measures as a kind of reserve instrument in the case that Russia escalates this conflict. Now, due to the veto of some states, the Council then agreed on the worst outcome. No dialogue and more of the same that did not work for the last 7 years. Now, as long as the European Union is prone to this kind of blockages, strategic autonomy will probably remain a distant goal. What does it mean? I mean, the strategic compass talks about these four baskets. It talks about crisis management, capability development, resilience, and partnerships. It does not mention institutional reforms. And I mean, I would argue, and the peace report argues, that institutional reforms is, of course, another key to strategic autonomy. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Yeah, I think you raised a couple of questions and points we hopefully will tackle later in the panel discussion, especially the question of institutional reforms and I suppose also expectation management, which is something where the EU is and its member states are probably not having been very successful in the past. I would like now to bring in Sonja Momberg, Policy Officer at the European External Action Service. And Sonja works at the Division on Security and Defense and is involved in the drafting process of the Strategic Compass. So the Compass has been mentioned a couple of times now, and it is expected to be published under the French presidency in the first half of 2022. And it is, overly loaded with high expectations to be a document to define common objectives and ambitions for the next 5 to 10 years, and also to provide some clarity and transparency internally and externally with regards to where common foreign and security or security and defense policy takes us. But what provisions are taken, are put into place to ensure that these expectations are not being disappointed? Sonja.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I have to say I read the peace report with a lot of great interest, and there are great recommendations that I have already circulated. And I particularly appreciated the clarification on the strategic autonomy debate. I think there's a very loaded discussion going on, and I would like to maybe add one element that is not so often discussed. There is a lot of an entire world beyond the catchy headlines. There are differences, of course, in outlook. We don't have to beat around the bush, but there's also a lot of common ground. And that common ground is the basis of everything we've done over the last few years to strengthen the EU and security and defense policy. And a lot of that common ground is also what has paved the way for the strategic compass, which, as many of you have said, is a very ambitious and very important project. But at the same time, in terms of expectation management, is also not a silver magic bullet that is going to solve everything overnight. But to bring in a more positive note, you've asked what is needed for the strategic compass to give European security and defense policy a common direction. And I'd like to make 3 points, essentially. The first is, for the first time ever, we have a European threat analysis. For the first time in the EU framework, we have a 360-degree view into the world at all the different threats and challenges that lie ahead in the next couple of years, some of them facing the EU and the EU security quite directly. So that is a really good foundation for all the discussions we're currently having on the concrete goals and objectives the EU wants to be able to tackle in the light of those threats and challenges. Ursula Schröder has described it as a storm, and indeed the picture is very bleak. If we look at destabilization, growing geopolitical competition, the pressures on the multilateral system, but also if we look at hybrid and other transnational threats to the EU directly. And there is agreement amongst member states that if we want to be able to act, we need to do it together, and we need a European response. Now that's sort of the basis, and we've tried to organize this process quite logically. So departing from what are we actually facing, we want to tackle exactly the question that Ursula Schröder has also posed: what for? What do we as Europeans want to be able to do in security and defense? And one should add, what don't we want to be able to do? That can also be part of the discussion, maybe implicitly, maybe explicitly. And the second point I want to make here is, if we want the compass to make a difference, if we want the compass to really bring things forward, we need political will, we need commitment in EU member states. And I can tell you, over the last couple of months, we've been in the so-called strategic dialogue phase. We've had a lot of discussion amongst member states who've been extremely proactive. They've written 20 food for thought papers in groups of like-minded member states. They've organized almost 50 workshops, and I don't remember a time in EU security and defense where this has been as intensely discussed amongst member states. So that in itself, so the process in itself is already an added value, and we can see that there is a lot of commitment on the side of member states. Finally, the third point I want to make is we, of course, need concrete ideas. We need to know what exactly are the goals and objectives. I can't give you a finalized list because, of course, we're still very much in the process. But what has been distilled from the discussions so far is there is agreement amongst member states that the EU needs to become a more capable security provider, a more capable actor in crisis management. There have been discussions about how to increase the effectiveness and the flexibility, but also the responsiveness of EU crisis management. Civilian CSDP is also a part of this, as the EU, of course, is taking a holistic approach to crisis management. We've also discussed how can we clarify our and I guess strengthen the partnerships we have with international organizations, the UN, NATO, OSCE, but also ASEAN, the African Union, and third countries. And what we're currently discussing is how can we maybe have a more tailor-made approach to these partnerships to make sure they're of benefit to both sides. And I'll just leave it at that. And I look forward also to some food for thought that I can take back into the process.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sonia. And yeah, we're quite happy that we can also, even though the dialogue phase is coming to an end this month, that we can hopefully contribute with the exchange about the peace report to that. I'd like now to turn to Hannah Neumann, member of the European Parliament and chair of the delegation for the relations with the Arab Peninsula, and also vice chair of the subcommittee on human rights and member of the subcommittee on security and defense. And Hannah has also a research background with a PhD in politics and peace and conflict studies. So Hannah, I'd like to ask you, what expectations and what apprehensions do you connect with the strategic compass? I mean, it is a process which is member state driven, but it is not taking place in a vacuum. So when you look at the process from the European Parliament, where do you see maybe opportunities also, and where maybe challenges to really fulfill these expectations?
Thank you, Sidonia, for the questions. And first of all, I would like to thank the authors of the Friedensgutachten. It's always very good to have this look a bit from the outside, and I want to especially congratulate you on the chapter on arms export, which I read with great interest, and I'm looking forward to more cooperation, especially in this regard. On this one, I would also have a question to Sonia at a later stage. Regarding your question, first of all, I have to say that I'm very happy that we now have a discussion amongst member states, so amongst council members, on the strategy and level of ambition on the European level, because we have seen under the previous term under Federica Mogherini, the global strategy that was an attempt on behalf of more the EU institutions to define strategic priorities and the global, let's say, picture of how do we see the world. But it has never been, well, let's say, fully owned by the EU member states, because they have perceived this to be a Commission document. And I think it's very good that now the member states start to have these discussions as well amongst themselves. And I hope that the outcome of this strategic compass will be, well, let's see how ambitious it will be, but at least it will be something that when it's concluded will be owned and implemented by the member states. For me, the key issue around the debate of strategic autonomy is we have seen in the past that in the areas where that are European authority or European competence, or where the EU acts as one, even in foreign policy, we are immensely strong. I'm thinking about the trade policy, which is an EU policy area. And can you remember when Trump tried to attack us on trade? And he basically just ran into the void and lost it full-fledged, because there were 27, or back then still 28 member states standing unified and just telling him, well, you can try, but you're going to lose. The same when I think about, for example, data protection. There was this data protection law or regulation that came about in the EU. Facebook initially said, if you put that one forward, well, Facebook is not going to be active in the EU anymore. Now, basically, Facebook and all the other giants, for all countries in which they engage, just adopted the EU regulation because, well, they can't, I mean, the EU is the biggest market, they cannot live without it. So it's easy for them to just follow this one. And why do I give you these examples? Because they clearly show how big the EU, and I would not say autonomy, but sovereignty in foreign issues and on global agendas and items can be if we act as one. The problem on foreign and security policy, and I mean, we talk about climate, we talk about the pandemic and about others, and that's a question, I'm afraid it's beyond the focus of the strategic compass. What I perceive is that we have EU member states working together as the European Union if they have joint interests, and as long as they have joint interests. But once there are national foreign and security agendas that are not 100% covered by the EU interests, they start to also follow either on the sidelines or even undermining EU policies and with their national foreign policies. To give you 2 examples. For example, we have agreed on the EU level when it comes to Egypt that there will be no more budget support going to Sisi regime as long as he continues with the human rights violations. At the same time, Macron receives Sisi and tells him he will continue to supply him with whatever arms he wants to, and he's not, disregarding his human rights record, and he won't even stop it because of his human rights record. So it's like the EU sent forward to be the good cop so that we can all say, you know, we have this human rights values-based policy, and then member states with their national agendas undermining it. So Nord Stream issue in Germany, frankly said, is also one like that. So national governments having their pet projects and pursuing them against the interest of like 25 or 26 others. And for me, the key question is, and maybe it's the Conference on the Future of Europe, maybe it's some other forum, but I think we need to have a decision. Do we want to have an EU foreign policy, like we have an EU trade policy and like we have other EU policies? Or do we just want to limit us on where we have joint interests. But then, I mean, frankly said, we can stop the discussion around strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty, because this would only come if you throw the power, especially the economic and diplomatic power of 27 EU member states behind specific goals and behind specific strategies. And I also think the debate around, well, how much defense or how much peaceful or how much non-military issues do we need? I mean, I will always fight for the non-military power. But there we need a strategy behind it. If we have a strategy behind how we spend our development aid, if we have a strategy behind how do we support economies, if we have a strategy behind how do we use our trade policy, then we have so much power to set standards and to shape the global order. So for me, the problem is the strategy, and then we can discuss about the tools and which are more useful. And then I would always say, well, the non-military ones are more useful than the military ones. But at the moment, and even heard it from Sonja's discussion, we are discussing the capabilities. And I mean, we can raise up capabilities in all these sectors and put money into all of it, as long as we don't know where, or we can't decide as 27 what we use it for and stop undermining it with national agendas. And that for me would continue to be the key discussion. And that's why I kind of refuse to start engaging, whether we call it strategic autonomy or sovereignty or whatsoever. It's just, are we having an EU foreign policy or are we not having an EU foreign policy? That's the key question. And one small question, because for me, that's one of the main areas that show how we are not having an EU policy at the moment, although we pretend to have one, is the issue of arms exports. We are now building a domestic European Defence Union. We are investing EU money either, well, through the funds or even EU budget through the European Defence Fund, or well, the European Peace Facility, where it's member states putting money in together. We're having internal procurement markets and everything. So we want to behave like an EU actor in defense. But export decisions remain national authority, and no one can answer the question which country actually makes an export decision over an arms system that has components from 15. I mean, why should it be always France? Well, because the rules are the easiest ones, but that's not how we should go. Is this discussion about arms export part of the strategic compass, Sonja, or is it not? Because that's also something, as much as I like the European member states taking ownership of this process, it means that the parliament has never seen a threats analysis. And I only informally have seen like baskets and stuff. So there is now, well, once again, a lack of transparency and parliamentary control on this process.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hannah. I would give that question straight back to Sonja, because, yeah, I mean, it is a question of, parliamentary oversight. And if the EU wants to become a full-fledged foreign and security actor, there also needs to be, just the discussion: will the parliament be involved? Will it have a more more responsibility? And then we come again to the question of institutional reforms. But yeah, the question for you, Sonja, but I also would like to pick up on the Conference of the Future of Europe you mentioned, because I think that's a point which is also raised in the peace report, and it mentions that the whole discussion about the role of the EU as a peace actor needs to be more broadly discussed, and to go beyond the expert circles to maybe eventually have a broader consensus of the role. But Sonja, please.
Thank you so much. 3 points, Hannah. First, on arms exports and arms exports control. We've had many discussions about this already, but it's not at the moment part of the compass process. So that's something that's discussed in other contexts. The second part that is very, very important that you raised, the involvement of the European Parliament, that's something that is absolutely vital, because if we don't convince parliamentarians and get the legitimacy for what we're doing in security and defense, if we don't also in extension convince citizens of what it's necessary to do in security and defense, I think we're missing out a big part of what is necessary. I understand there have been very regular briefings to SEDE and AFED by the External Action Service, and if there is a need to have more regular briefings, I'm very happy to take that on board, and I'm fairly sure that everyone in the External Action Service is happy to provide as much information as is needed. And at the same time, a caveat, we can also only ever tell you as much as we can say at this moment in time in the process. So I think there are many different ways to maybe have a parliamentary debate. I personally have always thought maybe also use the interparliamentary conferences to also get into the conversation with national parliamentarians, but definitely an active parliamentary involvement sort of in the debate, you know, in the debate, what is necessary in security and defense is absolutely welcomed and important. On the threat analysis, this question has come from the European Parliament. I know it's come from many national parliaments. The thing is, it's a classified intelligence document. It was conducted by getting input from all the member states' national intelligence services, and EU INCEN has then written a single threat analysis. It is very difficult to release such a document and make it available because of the sensitive nature of the content. And I understand there are many discussions on how there can be parliamentary insight. I know there have been briefings to the European Parliament, and at the moment I know there's some discussion on how to further address this need, which I completely understand, but at the same time it's always a question of balancing the need to look at it and the sort of sensitive nature of the contents. And what I find fascinating is I don't think I've ever heard anyone asking for the NATO threat analysis, which is a classified document and not releasable. And suddenly there's this huge interest in the EU's threat analysis. And I think it's great, there is an interest, but I think what's even more important than to understand what exactly is written in the threat analysis is what follows. What are the political implications? And I think a lot of that can be discussed also without having read sort of the detailed analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. There was actually also a question in the chat also about the threat analysis. And also on the scope, how far it really concentrates on the classic security and defense threats, or if there are also other non-classical threats are taken into account. Is that also does that also fall under classified, or can you maybe describe a little bit how far the scope goes?
I can't go into the detail. I hope you understand of what the elements are in the threat analysis, but I think the question aims at, is it just narrowly security and defense, or is it looking a little bit, does it have a broader scope? And I would like to say we need to be very careful at sort of delineating what we're talking about. And the EU has a very, very wide toolbox, and the strategic compass looks at a certain strand of security and defense. I understand in the chat there was the question of whether that was a too narrow of a focus. That is to be debated, but certainly there was a need to have clarity, and you always have to somehow focus on one thing or another. But certainly in baskets such as resilience, but also crisis management. I mean, most of the tools are not military tools. And I don't want this discussion to make it seem like the only thing the EU is now doing is military. That's absolutely not the case. We're using all the tools in the toolbox. A lot of the tools when it comes to technology and cyber and digitalization, a lot of that also falls into the competence of the European Commission. So definitely we're looking at all the intersections of tools, but not everything is directly addressed in the Compass, which is a forward-looking document for security and defense to try to define what do we want to do in that area, where are the cross-cutting issues, but how can we then move this area forward? So it's not a new global strategy. If the global strategy had this, the strategic compass is operationalizing it for a specific part.
Okay, thank you very much for clarifying that. I would like now to go back to Matthias, because and that maybe also connects to the question with regards to scope. Well, you mentioned that the EU is not a military actor, but it is a very strong and as a structural peace builder. And at FES, we're at the moment running a project looking into the EU as a potential sovereign actor in foreign and security policy. And we're looking at actually tools that are already in place to project this sovereign power. Do you have some examples of where you think the EU has really an added value with regards to other organizations, institutions that are projecting security, well, namely the OSCE and NATO, and where you also take the optimistic view on what the EU actually can do as a security provider?
I mean, here I would agree with Hannah Neumann's analysis. I mean, the European Union, in a lot of areas, the European Union is an extremely powerful actor. The European Union is extremely powerful and effective when it comes to regulations, when it comes to organizing regulations not only within the European Union but also on a global scale. The European Union has been very effective in organizing sanctions regimes. Now, if you look at what the European Union has done, for example, with regard to Russia, or nowadays with regard to Belarus, it's really amazing how the European Union and its member states were able to find compromises way above the lowest common denominator of interests to organize those sanctions. So this is remarkable. As I mentioned already, I mean, the European Union is extremely good in creating rules for the common globe, to organize a common globe, and the European Union is a respected partner in this field. I mean, compared to NATO and to the OSCE, the European Union has certain advantages and disadvantages. I mean, of course, NATO is the coherence of NATO rests to quite an extent on the American leadership role, right? And the European Union does not have a kind of a natural hegemon. So the European Union needs other instruments to organize or to provide for coherence. But again, the European Union is much more trusted. The European Union is much more reliable just because the European Union is more rules-based than NATO is. I mean, compared with the OSCE, of course, the membership of the European Union is more restricted. We might talk about Hungary and Poland and so on and so forth, but still, I mean, all of the members of the European Union are democracies. And it's not the case, for example, if you look at the OSCE. I mean, therefore, the OSCE is more inclusive and can do things together with Russia, for example, in organizing or supervising the not very stable arrangements in the Donbass region. I mean, this is something that the OSCE can do much better than the European Union, because the European Union is really has a more restricted member base. So I see, I mean, advantages and disadvantages of all those three organizations, and they complement each other in a certain way. Again, what I'm trying to get across is that the European Union is really a very, very competent actor and has a lot of potential when it comes to important things. Yeah? And it has structural weaknesses when it comes to others.
Yeah, that's a little bit the well, some of the issues probably there are, because, or with regards to expectation management, because on paper or in theory there are many positive aspects and potential, but then there are often stark disappointments in some of the positioning with regards to foreign and security challenges. I would like to also pick up a question from the chat about the role of the European Parliament with regards to foreign and security, or well, with regards to a stronger role of the European Parliament, and also bring in the question of the Conference for the Future of Europe, and with the Parliament being more involved, would that also imply a broader discussion of foreign and security issues, and would it help shape and generate ideas how to push for stronger and common foreign and security policy? Hannah?
Well, thank you, Sidonie, for this question, and I think it came from Eike, so thank you for you as well. So I would say at the moment, it's the most exciting time to be in the European Parliament with regards to this question, because things are changing slowly. There is still this position on behalf of the most member states that foreign policy is their business. And then we have the European External Action Service, and I think Sonia explained in a very nice way how we are being involved. So it's like whatever people feel confident sharing with us, they share it with us. They even come often and share with us whatever they are confident with sharing with us. And then we can listen to it, and then we can comment on it. And then they take back whatever they are confident to take back. Well, this is not how I understand parliamentary involvement or parliamentary control. We are not part of a stakeholder consultation, to be very frank. And at the moment, we are trying to fight our way as parliaments into a stronger role on that one. First of all, saying if you want an EU foreign and security policy, you need to have a parliament that's your counterpart, and obviously that's the European Parliament. In some areas, we have kind of shown to the EAS, to the member states and the Commission, how much power we have if we test it. I reference now, for example, the China Agreement on Investment, where, well, large parts of the Commission and the member states wanted to push it ahead, and the Parliament decided, especially because we were sanctioned, but also because of the content, to at least put it in the freezer until we will not be sanctioned anymore. And now it's in the freezer, nothing's going to move. But we really needed to test that bit of power. Then we have other areas where basically we challenge the assumption that we have nothing to say. The European Peace Facility is one example. We are constantly told it's an off-budget instrument, although it's called the European Peace Facility, and although it's put in place to strengthen the role of Europe, European Parliament doesn't have a say. Well, now we kind of found out that part of the services that are done, like the conflict analysis, like the management, like the evaluation, like the security checks that are done around, for example, equipment support going to the member states. Just the equipment support is funded by the European Peace Facility, but the services around are actually funded from the EU budget that has created a new unit in the European Union External Action Service. And based on that one, we are now trying to see how much of a say or information we can at least have on these conflict analyses. On other issues, we need to work around, and that's very weird feeling for a member of the European Parliament. So that I need to ask my colleagues in, for example, the German Parliament or the Spanish Parliament to put in written questions to their government, because their government needs to respond to them, but no government needs to respond to us for this kind of written questions. So, you know, we think it's good that the European Union has a stronger involvement in foreign security policy, and we are now fighting our ways into having a stronger say and also being respected as an equal counterpart, as usually parliaments are on the national level when it comes to foreign and security policy. And I mean, you could be frustrated because you are not as the European Parliament, but I sense, especially amongst the new MEPs, more of a fighting spirit, like, well, let's just test how far our rights go. And just, I mean, as the baseline, it sounds a bit like a fun, you know, fun exercise. I really think the member states, if they are sincere in, call it strategic autonomy, sovereignty, or whatever, but a stronger EU foreign and security policy, no one stops them from giving the parliament additional rights that it may not have according to the treaties, but that it could just be granted by member states because they would like to have a truly European debate. And that again brings us back to the question, do we have joint interests or do we want to have a joint foreign policy?
Thank you very much. There is actually a question for Mr. Fellenberg on the question of, well, with regards to the reflection we heard right at the beginning, where he was also asking for, well, stressing the importance of civil and military means, but then also bringing it together with one of the recommendations from the peace report that, well, to tap onto the COVID peace dividend. Unfortunately, Mr. Fellenberg had to leave already, but we have people from his staff in the audience, namely Mr. Ackermann and Mr. Kirschner. I don't know if you would be prepared to react to some of the questions. If you could indicate that by just raising your hand, and then we could bring you into the discussion. Perfect. Mr. Ackermann, then I would like to give you the floor, if that's okay. I will just bring you onto the panel. And then it would be great if you could, yeah, answer the question. Hello, Mr. Ackermann. I remember we met at a previous discussion of the peace report here in Brussels. And just to repeat, the question was with regards to the peace dividend and the, well, the question of should global social inequality not be tackled as a priority, and yeah, as a major priority with regards to peace and security.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. So looking back to our concept of just peace, social justice is one of the very important dimensions inside the just peace concept. And I think the social justice, a global social justice is very important to build up peace worldwide. I think Mr. Dembinski will agree in this. And so therefore, if EU set up an agenda for security policy and defense policy, this issue must be pointed out into a strategic compass. So I totally agree that we don't have, I totally agree that it is not enough to focus on the defense capabilities and the military capabilities. I think I totally agree that the strength of European Union is to build up peace structures. That is our history. So therefore, I think to put this issue on the agenda of the strategic compass is very necessary from the ecclesiastical point of view.
Thank you very much. Perfect. And thank you also for coming straight while being accosted here onto the panel. Before I start with the last round of questions to the panelists about the most positive outcome of the strategic compass, just to give you some time to reflect, there's also a question to Ms. Schröder in the chat about internal security and societal resilience aspects when we speak about strategic autonomy. Ursula Schröder, could you please expand on this and how to avoid getting too inward looking and building up a fortress Europe?
Yes, thank you. We argue that the broadening of the concept of strategic autonomy or sovereignty or whatever you would really like to call it, because there are subtle differences in the concepts, but we also thought it's better to focus on substance before we talk about state sovereignty and everybody starts losing interest, is that a broadened conception of a peace political concept of sovereignty needs to look at our own societies. We've seen in the field of democracy promotion and the erosion of democratic processes in the EU, also in our own societies, that there are large problems at hand. We need to have peaceful solutions to the erosion of democracy here, and we've talked about the relevance of processes in other contexts today before, and we believe that processes on the inside of the EU need to be strengthened, need to become more resilient, and need to be more attuned to also peaceful processes of constructive conflict resolution. And the thing is, it's not about Fortress Europe, it's about acknowledging that the threat perceptions that we see are more likely to be not from the outside alone, but to be in a sense globalized, interconnected, and permeable. And we know that risk assessments today that also look into the future concern issues like critical infrastructure protection. They concern issues like cybersecurity that affect critical infrastructure protection if people are not actually acknowledging international cyber norms. And we know that our peace here is actually threatened also by disinformation campaigns. And these are all issues that we need to take into account, and we can no longer pretend that there is an internal security and an external security and an internal peace that is somehow separate in the EU from global peace. We need to think these dimensions together, and we need to do so in a way that is in solidarity, as we've argued before, that is in sync with also what is happening on the other side of the world. And one thing that we found particularly striking about the current debate about the COVID pandemic is the northern focus of it. Is the focus that is not global, but that is focused on creating EU internal vaccine programs and so on, and vaccine distribution, which is obviously good, but it needs to go beyond that. And to have this global inclusive perspective, we also need to look inside and see what we are doing wrong and where we can be better inside. But this is clearly not about creating a fortress, but about seeing threats and threat perceptions together in a joint way, as this is what we are facing. And the climate crisis is maybe the most important of them all at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much coming in for that. Yeah, I would like to start the last round with the panelists. And I would like to ask all three of you for your main priorities to be included into the strategic compass to make it, from your perspective, a success, and what political signals would you like to see during the French presidency to really put the strategic compass into place, and that it really is a document that will inform further security and defense policy making. And I would start with the same order, or I would go with the same order as we started. So with Matthias first, please.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, three quick points. Two have already been mentioned. That is, institutions, that institutional reform should be included. Arms control, export controls should be an issue. And I would also raise a third issue, and that relates to China and to our interdependent relations with China. Interdependence means, of course, that concepts like influence, socialization, etc., are no one-way street, and that we should be prepared to protect ourselves, our societies, our governments, our companies against normative pressure originating from China. What does it mean? For example, if China puts pressure on individual European companies because they criticize certain human rights violations in China, we should be able to show solidarity with those companies and maybe even protect them and maybe even have a kind of solidarity fund that helps them in such situations. So I think this would be something that might be discussed when preparing the strategic compass. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So Sonja, well, the question is probably quite difficult to answer for you, what you would like to see in the compass, but as you're involved in the process, at the end of it, where do you think, it's probably not, where do you see the signal that the process does not come to an end, but basically stimulates further security and defense discussions? What is your hope for the end of, well, the drafting process of the compass?
Thank you. Also, Matthias Dembinski, for the ideas. Maybe I take that as an occasion to once more stress that we need to be very careful in delineating CFSP and CSDP. They have different scope and they sometimes overlap, but I think it's important just in terms of expectation management also what will be in the compass. It's important to understand that the compass looks at security and defense. Maybe I can say what kind of document I'm hoping this will be and what expectations I have for the process. For the process, I hope that it continues to be one that sees the great investment of EU member states and that also sees them tackling some of the more difficult issues. And at the moment, I think that looks promising, and I hope we continue in that vein. In terms of what kind of document, I hope it will be an actionable document with clear timelines so that we don't need another implementation plan or any other document, but that we have one document for the next 5 to 10 years that gives really clear guidance for what we want to be able to do. Some of the examples that might be interesting to include there are very concrete and very defense-oriented. But for example, there's been much discussion on an initial entry force, for example, or advanced scenario planning, something that would help common or collective European training and exercising by way of preparation for crises, which will also inadvertently maybe help to speed up decision making. So I hope it'll be an actionable document with many concrete ideas that we can then work on implementing.
Thank you very much. And Hannah, yeah, the last expectations to you.
Well, on my expectations for the strategic compass, given the document it is and what Sonja just described, it can deliver. I hope that there will be extensive attention given to the civilian part of security, because it's always the case that institutionally it's just easier to talk about and to deal with military because we have these militaries and they are already there and we can just use them and deploy them. Still, we don't even have enough military that's committed to the EU level, but it's much more difficult for the civilian side, where you don't have basically like a standing core that you can rely on, where building up capabilities is a much bigger challenge. And also for the military, we have these ominous 2%, and we don't have something similar for the civilian side. So I always have the impression that we need to fight much stronger politically to bring the civilian part on the same leverage that the military is kind of automatically. We have also seen that in recent budget discussions of the EU. So here I really hope that within the strategic compass, we do not repeat the same mistakes that we have repeated in the past on this issue. And I'm quite confident that there are a number of EU member states who continue to uphold that. beyond the strategic compass, I really hope that we can have a discussion on how we can, what a roadmap could be towards a truly European foreign policy, and what areas. And that's kind of the question every time somebody from EU member states talks to me about, let's say, we want to move beyond anonymity and we want to move towards a strategic autonomy. Every time I ask the question, so what is the national interest, the national sovereignty area that you would like to give up and like give it to the European level? And I really think we need to have this complementary discussion to really fill this idea with concrete commitments that go beyond just pooling what is there already.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, that's I think that's already quite a creative idea to discuss in next couple of events. What sovereignty would member states like to give up? But indeed, yeah, I think the discussion didn't come to an end here, and we didn't really yet manage to completely fill the concept of strategic autonomy, but I think we did raise some interesting questions, and hopefully have also some ideas to further develop on. The time is up. I would like to thank everybody, the panelists, for the open and frank discussion. I would like to thank the co-organizers from the EU Office of the Protestant Church in Germany, namely Katrin Hatzinger. And I would also like to thank my colleague Sonja Molina for ensuring the technical moderation of the session. And yeah, I hope to see you eventually all again for the next presentation, maybe of the peace report, hopefully then in presence. So thank you very much and have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you too.
Bye.